Has Nintendo changed, or have we changed? Over the course of the past few weeks, I kind of decided to start watching some old press conferences from Nintendo, as well as a few presentations from the largest of competitors. Part of the reason I did this was because many people would frequently talk about how Nintendo has always been the way that it was, and that currently people are just overreacting strictly because they don't like the price of the Switch 2, or the fact that there's just so much more hate and vitriol out there. Now, I'm not really one to over-glorify the past. In general, I find humans and companies and corporations and any type of organization to generally hyper-focus on the betterment of themselves, specifically financially, rather than the betterment of humanity. And I say that because while I do think that Nintendo has gotten worse, it doesn't mean necessarily that I think that they were always good. In fact, I would argue that them, as well as pretty much every other major gaming company and corporation, is by nature of the way that these corporations operate, evil, by default. The only difference is how much worse they are at any given time, and that's almost always contingent on how much they need your dollar. The better they're doing, the worse they are. The worse they're doing, the nicer they are. That's just the circle of life. But regardless, I wanted to actually watch whatever footage I can find from the older E3s. I kind of wanted to do like a whole video on the evolution of the different types of E3s that Nintendo did, how they were with Reggie, how they were with Iwata, and how they were after both of them left. But I don't know that I can necessarily fit all of that into a single video. So what ended up happening was I ended up focusing primarily on E3 1995 and how the tone was during that time. Now, 1995 was the year that the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation 1 were released. They obviously didn't have worldwide releases, releasing in Japan first and then coming out to the West. And it was a year prior to the release of the Nintendo 64. At the time, it was still known as the Ultra 64. As far as everybody was concerned in E3 1995, the Sony PlayStation was new, it was generating a lot of hype, but it still was unsure whether or not it would become the new king. The discussions for the most part were still Nintendo versus Sega, Mario versus Sonic, and who was going to be making that shift to 3D better. I watched all three of these press conferences. Each one was roughly 30 minutes long. And I think the tone that was set during these presentations pretty much defined how the three companies would fare over the course of the following generation. During the Sega press conference, they were primarily focused on the justification for gaming consoles. Basically, they were mostly arguing about the existence of consoles as compared to multimedia devices like PCs, stressing the importance of buying your child a gaming console so they're not screwing around with your PC that you spend a crap ton of money on, highlighting how important it was to have a console that was explicitly optimized for gaming without having to spend all of that extra money and all of the extra work that you normally would do to get the same performance on a PC. It's almost as if they were trying to justify their existence, really the existence of the industry as a whole. And then what Sega ended up doing throughout this presentation was providing their evidence and their justification and their samples of why they are, or at least why they believe they are, worthy of a company to invest into. Why they think you should buy a Sega. They showed off games for the Sega Saturn, with graphics that at the time were considered very realistic. Also, a lot of them were very popular arcade titles that they were bringing to the homes. They spoke about demographics, about how important it was as a gaming industry to age with the gaming population. I'll be honest, while listening to the Sega Saturn presentation, I was actually very intrigued. It's weird, like you know what the outcome is going to be for Sega, but when you're watching this presentation and you're seeing the games that they're showing, it paints a very different picture about what was to come. Throughout the entire time while watching it, I was sitting there thinking, man, like, why didn't I buy a Sega Saturn? This looks great. This sounds great. And then it was kind of very obvious. All of a sudden, roughly around the end of the presentation, you find out that this thing is already available in stores on that day, or rather on that day in the West. It had already been released in Japan. And they announced at that press conference at the very end, after being so intriguing, that their retail price would be starting at $399. Now, mind you, within a year, it would cost half of that, because that's just the way the market worked back then. And I need to include that because I know other people are going to be like, oh yeah, back in the day, they used to pay more for video games and we're all complaining now. No, if you waited 6 months to a year, you could get it at half the price. And I've previously done videos about the argument against inflation and how gaming is significantly more expensive now than it ever was in the past due to a number of factors, so I won't waste too much time talking about it again here. But at the end of the Sega Saturn presentation, I understood it. They had believed that they were worth more than they actually were because they were the top dog that was competing with Nintendo. They had some successful early 90s years. They were knocking the king off of their perch as far as they were concerned. There was a lot of confidence going into the launch of the Sega Saturn, and Sega automatically assumed that no matter what they charged, they'd be able to win. And then after that, I watched the Sony press conference. Now, the way that I always understood it was that Sony didn't actually have a press conference. They just went up there and said the price. That's not actually what happened, which is funny because that's how many people report that it happened. They're just like, oh yeah, in E395, the only thing Sony did was come up there and say the price and that was it. No, what actually happened was you had a press conference that lasted like 25 minutes, and through most of it, it was Sony showing demos of their games and what they're going to be providing to the gaming industry. They were giving their own credentials. They were saying why they believe that they can do it initially, showing all of the different dynamic stuff that they've brought to the tech world, and how they're going to translate that into the top-of-the-line gaming that they would provide with the PlayStation 1, how much more advanced this console would be. There were a lot of parallels between what Sega was doing and what Sony was doing, but in Sony's case, you felt more like they had a need to convince you as why they were going to be so good. They showed you why it was going to be good by providing certain demos that, like I said, in a lot of ways mirrored what Sega was doing. The difference is, at the very end of the Sony press conference, that's when they called up the gentleman to stand up there and announce the price at $299, $100 cheaper than what Sega was doing. And it was met with cheers and an applause, and people were excited to buy into Sony's PlayStation. Now, once again, in about a year and a half, a little bit less than 2 years actually, this thing was half the price of $299. I mean, gosh, within less than a year was already down to $199. But still, Sony showed up to E3 1995 with a point to prove that they have the tech and they have the prices that are respectable and they have the games that are coming in that are going to appeal and intrigue the market and make them feel like they have to buy in. Once again, I watched this press conference and I was like, man, like I'm feeling this Sony vibe. The PlayStation 1 really was setting the tone, and they were doing it at a price that didn't feel like you were getting ripped off, that felt like they wanted you to buy in rather than be like, hey, this is a premium, if you can afford it, come in, if not, we don't care. And then you have Nintendo's press conference. Now, I've always known nothing about Nintendo in E3 1995. The only thing I've ever known was that Sega gave a presentation, charged people too much, Sony came in, undercut it by $100, and they won. That's all I knew. E3 1995 Nintendo always kind of just showed this guy that looked like Mr. Rogers go up there and talk for a bit, and that's all I would see in all of the recaps. But naturally, because I was curious, I ended up watching this thing. 33 minutes long. In the first 8 or so minutes, they spoke about how there is a bar that is set with the gaming world, and they specifically used Donkey Kong Country as an example. He said that now that the gaming industry has seen Donkey Kong Country, whatever the next game is has to be better than Donkey Kong Country, and with every single game that's released consequently, it has to always get better and better. This is the expectation of the people. The expectation of the developers is to always continue to improve what came before. He did this without showing any gameplay footage, without talking about any games that they had planned for the Nintendo 64. And in fairness, the Nintendo 64 was still a years out. It was not coming out anytime soon, unlike the Saturn and the PlayStation 5, which were already in some markets. But he didn't discuss any games for the Super Nintendo, didn't show off any demos, didn't show off any conceptual designs. That wouldn't be done until the following year. So if for 8 minutes they talked about the bar that continues to rise with Nintendo titles, or gaming in general rather, and the entire press conference was roughly 33 minutes long, what do you think they talked about for the remaining 25 minutes? Maybe you never thought about it. I know I didn't. It's very obvious though, when you do actually start guessing. If it's not your first guess, it'll probably be in your top 5. He spent the rest of that entirety of that presentation talking about piracy. I'm not kidding, I was floored. Talking about the bootleg game market, talking about how in Hong Kong people are selling games, talking about how the black market has expanded all over the world now, and how bad it is for gaming companies that piracy exists, and that it's something that all of us should band together and fight against because it could mean the death of the industry. He did this for 25 minutes. Not a single game was shown. The only thing they talked about was the importance of fighting against copyright infringement. Now, as much as the next guy, I understand a company's gotta protect their assets. And I understand that as a gaming company, you gotta fight against piracy. That's just part of the job, I suppose. But imagine showing up to a gaming press conference where your competitors are going to be showing off their consoles and their titles, and they're here to topple you. And the only thing you focus on, effectively, is piracy. That's forgettable. That breeds no excitement. You've effectively given nobody a reason to want to wait out and purchase the Nintendo 64. That's why, to this day, when I think of E3 1995, all I think about is the Sega Saturn being overpriced and PlayStation undercutting them by $100. Because Nintendo didn't give people anything to think about, and they didn't think they had to, because in their minds, after the success of the NES followed by the Super Nintendo, they believed you were going to buy in because of how great they are, because of how much you enjoyed the previous console. They didn't need to convince you. You were going to buy their console no matter what. The only thing they were more concerned about is how to make sure every single one of their games were legitimate copies instead of losing, 5 to 10% of the entire market due to piracy? Now look, it's not that other companies don't come in and combat piracy. Even from back then, many of them were against piracy. For obvious reasons, it's money that they feel like they could be earning. And until now, it's not like Nintendo is the only one that's fighting against it. But the problem is, many of the other companies, the way that they operate, especially back then, they viewed it as the cost of doing business. This was a loss that was going to happen regardless. And we could mitigate it as much as we want, but realize that to an extent, there's always going to be a little bit more of a loss. The issue with Nintendo is every one of those pennies, every one of those dollars lost matters to them. And it creates this image of a company that cares significantly more about who's going to be pirating their titles, more about their legal practices, more about the way that they shut down different companies, the money that they're spending on all of their lawyers, the money that they're spending on attacking kids. They care more about that than they care about the actual development of their titles. That's the image that it gives off. I'm not saying that the developers are not enjoying themselves and being very passionate and creating amazing games. I'm saying what it looks like on the outside to a lot of people that are not buying Nintendo. That's why there's a Nintendo Ninja Lawyers meme and not a Sony Ninja Lawyers meme. Put your hands up if in the past month you or someone you know or somebody that commented online said something along the lines of, "I don't know why Nintendo gets so much crap for this. All the companies do it." It's because Nintendo does it to a self-sabotaging degree, and they want you to know that they're combating it, and they want to make sure they release statements saying they're combating it. There's a sense of pride with every DMCA because in their minds, they know that if they make an example out of a few people, a lot of other ones will follow suit. That's why they have that image, because they want to have that image, and that's why they get the negative press that they always do in relation to this stuff as compared to the competition. Now look, I'm thinking about doing some more of these E3 videos because I've watched a lot of E3s recently and I think they're worth talking about. I want to do a video about E3 2001 when Iwata gave one of the best presentations, or speeches rather, that I've ever heard from anybody, specifically in the gaming world. And that's actually kind of what sprouted all of this, is that I wanted to do a video about Iwata's 2001 speech on the 10-year anniversary of his death, which is actually today. Unfortunately, I missed the marker on that one, but I do want to mention that speech, and I think if you have a chance to look up Iwata's 2001 E3 speech, you might understand why so many people appreciate this guy for what he was. But outside of that whole presentation, outside of the awesome reveal of all of the different games that would eventually come out for the Nintendo GameCube, there's a moment about 27-ish minutes into the press conference where Shigeru Miyamoto shows off the mini DVDs that were for the GameCube. They mention how much memory was on these things, and of course they have to mention how its proprietary security is going to defend against copying. It just screams like it's a bullet point that had to be mentioned, rather. There's a rule that goes out with Nintendo where they want this image that they're always going to be fighting modders and hackers and pirators. And again, the issue is not that people that pirate are necessarily doing something right. That's not what I'm arguing here. The issue is by hyper-focusing on this combat against piracy, Number one, you're challenging hackers. And when you challenge hackers, that's why the GameCube, the Wii, the Wii U are the easiest consoles to pirate, to emulate ever since their releases. Number two, when that discussion is always front and center, when people know that you're always trying to shut things down front and center, that's when you get that kind of image.